Hi, everyone. We're about to start. We'll wait a few more minutes to let everyone in who are joining us today. But welcome, and we'll say welcome a couple times to Comm Lead Reconnects and experience a three-part learning experience that you're joining us for. And today is the first one of it. And our topic is recreating accountability and trust via storytelling, design, and content. I'll introduce myself in just a minute, but I also want to make sure that Hanson is here with me, who's going to co-facilitate this session in collaboration. Hi, Hanson.
Hi again. Thanks very much for setting the tone for this incredible conversation and this series that we're going to have. You settled upon this topic a couple of months ago, and I think it's just so amazingly tuned for the times we're in and the times we're about to embark upon. So thank you for doing that.
And thank you for joining me. And again, we'll wait just a few minutes before we introduce ourselves, but we encourage you all to introduce yourselves in the chat. I'm already seeing, Hanson, by the way, that we have participants all around the country. I saw also many countries represented in our mix as well, from Mexico to India to Germany. I myself am today joining you from Turkey. So we're reaching the globe in our event today. So thank you all, and please welcome each other and say hi and share with us. Thank you to one of our participants today, Shri, for igniting this share. So please share with us where you're joining us from, and maybe who you are too. If you, after we're done with that, you can share with us what you do as well, and what's your motivation for being with us today.
I love that we're reaching around the world like that. I think my dad is also joining us from Canada. And I too am in a foreign land right now. I'm on the east side of our region in Redmond, Washington, over at Microsoft. So we're coming from all walks of life and all places today.
Exactly, and maybe for the reference of those who are joining us from all around the world, maybe some of whom are our families, friends, but also our community members. I am Ekin Yashin. I am the director of the Communication Leadership Program, housed in University of Washington, which is in Seattle. We are a pioneering master's program that are preparing our students to a variety of different careers in communication and leadership related endeavors in creativity. So what we're discussing is directly related to what we do. But today we're joined by everyone. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So welcome. And joining me is Hanson.
Thanks for the cue. And I'm Hanson Hossein. I'm co-founder of Communication Leadership, a program that has continued to grow thanks to our learning community, who have really helped shape our focus on trust, on how we connect with each other as people, and how we find these moments to really make sense of what's happening. And this is definitely a moment that we're going through. And I can't think of a more opportune time for a communication leader to say, hold on, what's going on, what's coming next, and what will be our next normal. So I'm really pleased you're all joining us in what will truly be a collaborative learning opportunity hosted by our graduate program.
Exactly. And so maybe what we'll do in the beginning, as we're also slowly, people are joining us, is to start by just telling you very quickly what's happening for the next 3 weeks starting today. So Hanson, tell us a little bit, because you were, as the founder of the program too, one of the people who conceived this idea. What is Comm Lead Connects for those who know our program and for those all around the world who are joining us today?
You know, the program has always been a very public-facing entity. We've always wanted to bring the latest of what we're learning in our classrooms to our community. So we've always sort of seen these community events as an opportunity to do that. 3 years ago, we conceived Connects as a way to do this in a signature manner, very much like South by Southwest or other events you might be aware of. So we launched it 3 years ago, and we've constantly found these particular subjects are just bubbling up that we thought would be relevant to our audiences. Artificial intelligence 2 years ago, last year, the future of work, and now this year, this transformational time. And it's always meant to convene and educate and to connect as much as possible. And I think we keep getting better and better every year. And this year, unique is that we've been able to partner with the University of Washington to pilot a new micro-credential from the University of Washington that people will earn if they successfully attend all 3 of our weeks sessions and then submit a reflection upon that.
Yes, and that's a really exciting opportunity. Again, you'll all be recognized for participating And again, these are all accessible and free to all of those who are joining us. Maybe let's quickly share with you what the thinking behind is for this year's event, as Hanson just mentioned. We're doing a 3-part lunchtime in Seattle series. So I know that it's nighttime for some of you and other times of the day all around the world. So in these 3-part series, starting today, we're trying to examine how our world is transforming and emerging forms of communication, leadership, and creativity practices that may have emerged from a need to survive in this moment, but have been kind of being stabilized and used in this moment that we're trying to make sense of the world that we're all becoming part of. Today is the first part of that conversation. We will continue the conversation in the coming 2 weeks. These series are very much embedded in learning. So we try to give you a taste of one of our graduate classes in a really accessible way. Throughout, we're driven, and I know Kirsten shared earlier and she'll share again, the learning objectives that actually move us today. We're trying to make sense of these emerging practices, particularly today in storytelling, design, and content, to make sense of what's coming next, to be aware of the tools, to be aware of the challenges, and to create a learning community amongst all of us. So you can see them right now on the screen as well. So we are looking at both identifying needs and challenges, but also exciting opportunities in these 3 realms that we're exploring today. So it will be a very exciting day of learning for all of you.
And to set the tone for this conversation before we introduce our very special guests, I want to share a quote from an opinion writer here in the United States, Peggy Noonan, who wrote about this recently. And I'm making this a driving thought for the class that I'm teaching in the spring around leadership and emerging technology and trends. We're in a transformational time. Some things might have changed inch by inch over the last few decades. We're transformed in one large, incredible 12-month shift. So many institutions will have to be nimble and far-sighted now, or they won't survive. So we're in the after times, and every stakeholder is going to have to be generous, patient, and far-sighted in a way they've never been before. And that's what we're hoping you will be here with us today, being far-sighted and thinking a lot differently about what is going to come based on the experiences that we're living through right now.
And you have multiple tools of learning. So we have really esteemed guests that Hanson will introduce just in 1 minute. But just about the structure of the day, and for those of you who are joining us. So we're going to start by a conversation with our 3 esteemed guests and their perspectives, their examples, their learning, and their responses to this moment. Hanson and I will maybe ask a few questions, but driven by these learning objectives, please also share your questions in the chat box. We have 2 student leads. You're seeing them already active in the chat, Kirsten Minton and Tara Watson, who will be helping you out throughout the event. So thanks to them for facilitating and helping us make this event possible. After the conversation, after the first hour, we'll also give you an opportunity to reflect in smaller groups. So there'll be breakout groups with activities and questions inspired by today's conversation. This will be a platform for you to apply what you learned today to your own settings, wherever you may be, whatever you do, even if you're exploring careers in this realm. We're also joined today, and I want to say hi to all of you, by a number of our graduate program students, alumni, and friends. So welcome to all of them, but to all of you again to this really exciting experience of learning. Now, turning it over to Hanson to start with introductions and start the conversation.
Thanks, Akin. Yeah, Akin and I have many things in common, and one of the things we don't love are panel conversations. So we've designed this deliberately to be as dynamic and focused as possible. So hopefully you will enjoy it as much as we will. So to begin with, I'd like to introduce our 3 guests. Srinivasan, who is a professor of digital innovation at Stony Brook School of Journalism. I've known Sri for many years, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. But one of the reasons we invited him is because he is the CEO and co-founder of DigiMentors, which is a digital, social, and virtual hybrid events consulting company that has worked with corporations, nonprofits, and startups around the world. Over the time of the pandemic, he's hosted hundreds of episodes of multiple shows so that he can share accurate, useful information around various aspects of the crisis, which is being needed more than ever. He's also served as Chief Digital Officer of both the New York City, the city of New York, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and Columbia University. So this is a man who has established best practices around what it means to be an executive in a digital officer kind of position. So amazing leadership. And he taught for many years at Columbia University, which is where I met Sri when I was a student, and he was my professor, even though I'm 1 year older than he is. So Sri, welcome, and thanks very much for joining us. Becca Markham has a passion to ignite change and believes change starts with community and courageous conversation, which is music to our ears in our program. Since 2018, Becca has been actively advocating for equity and built a community of Black designers, which triggered the creation of Black Design Employee Resource Groups, or ERGs, within several top tech companies. And I've had a few conversations with Becca about her incredible work around this. She's combined her own experience as a Black designer in tech with research into equity and racial justice, and laid bare the evidence of white supremacy systems within design, and rallied for equity and greater representation of Black designers in the mostly white design space as a conference speaker and guest host on podcasts such as Revision Path and Designer. And especially important is that Becca is 2 quarters shy of earning her master's here in our program at Communication Leadership at the University of Washington. She's been a designer and art director at Amazon, senior product designer at Zillow, and is currently lead product designer on Instagram's well-being team. And Jenna Hanchard, who is an Emmy Award-winning journalist who has covered everything from the 2008 Olympics in Beijing, China, to the civil unrest in Ferguson, Missouri, following the murder of Michael Brown. As a news anchor and reporter at King 5, which is our NBC affiliate here in Seattle, she created the Emmy-nominated series Race and Parenting and the Emmy Award-winning series Race and Sports, which are community guides discussing race, racism, and identity. Jenna is a powerful storyteller who is moved by and dedicated to nuanced storytelling that centers Black and brown people. She brings her considerable talents, experience, and heart to producing Lola's Inc., a podcast celebrating stories of Black girl liberation. So Jenna, Becca, and Sri, thank you very much for joining us. Well, Sri, I think we'll start with you and open your mic up to get you very specifically to respond to this prompt in terms of how have you recreated accountability and trust? Very specifically, I believe, through the events that you've hosted through DigiMentors over the last 12 months.
Sure. Thank you so much, Hanson, for having me here. I'm delighted to be with you and your colleagues and your fans and friends around the world. What a great gathering of folks. Thank you very much for having me. I am going to answer your question by reflecting a little bit on what has been happening in the last year and really in all our lives, what has happened. I think I've been honored to know both Hanson and the Comm Lead work for more than a decade now, and I got to see it firsthand, as you'll see in just a second. And one of the things that we have understood is the value of the pioneering work that you all have done over these years, especially unlike in, say, business and other areas. This has been changing so quickly that we're all learning together. And it's been just great to see the importance of how communications fits into everything that we're trying to do. And we've seen also this past year, the failures of not having really good communications in various levels of the country, in various aspects of society, politics, and the real price that Americans and others have paid around the world for poor executive leadership and communication. So I'm just so glad to be here with all of you to think about these issues and with my esteemed co-panelists. And so I'm just going to show you a couple of quick things that may help us think about this issue. This blew up in the last couple of days. This is a strip from the Betty issue of 1997, where they talk about high school in 2021, and Betty's parents are saying to her that, oh, you're so lucky that you're being able to go to school at home. And when you look at this, they say they never have to carry books to school. They never have to worry about the weather. And Betty is saying that classes are about to begin. Now, what strikes me about this is how they were predicting that we would have flying cars and everything else, including this virtual school. but we did in fact get the virtual school, though we didn't get the flying cars yet. And it says their video monitor must remain uncovered at all times. That is a little too on the nose, I think, for a lot of us as we're thinking about this. I also think a lot about this because I have 17, about to turn 18-year-old twins. So they're in high school. They're sort of like Betty, and their kind of final year of high school has been ruined by being locked down in Manhattan with their parents. And that's something that I worry about. Will things get better? So at least have a good first year of college. By the way, maybe to some people in the audience, they don't know who Betty is at all, considering where pop culture is these days. So if you don't know who Betty is or Archie, you may know them through that Riverdale television show, even if not from the comics. So let me show you a couple of other things that I'm thinking about. I had the opportunity to host some of your former students at the Metropolitan Museum when I worked there as the chief digital officer. And this is how field trips used to be, right? You hear students from Seattle coming all the way out to New York City, and we're getting to talk to them in person. It was a wonderful opportunity for me to talk and learn from them and share ideas. It was just, I still remember that. And that's one of the many things that we're missing these days in this virtual world. Here, this is a photo of the two of us in Times Square, taken a few years ago. And this is, this opportunity to connect and share and talk and ask questions on the side. Like right now, you're doing all you can to make this as interactive as possible, as engaging as possible. But the chance, as I was walking through the museum with your students, to have them talk to me kind of, to have a quiet conversation as we're walking, or to point out specific things, all of that has been sort of lost. And it's sort of unfair that happened, but that is reality. I'm going to take you back, since I showed you a comic from 1997. I just go back here and take you to a website from 97. There was a time when this is what websites looked like. Your students wouldn't necessarily recognize this as a website. This is hand-coded HTML from the South Asian Journalists Association in March 97. And we hosted an event with Phil Scheffler, the executive editor of 60 Minutes, the great pioneering TV show. And Hansen was our host, and introduced Phil Scheffler. And I thought some of you might enjoy seeing a photo of Hansen with hair.
I totally forgot about that. Oh my gosh, thanks for all the
There's Hansen with hair. If some of you don't know that was ever a possibility. But again, this is what we lost in all the ways in which we have changed. People sitting around and talking and listening and whispering to each other as they're at an event. And that's something that certainly we all wish was different. And I also wanted to talk about one more time that I had a chance to be with the team here at Comm Lead. Was for an event we called the Social Media One Night Stand in 2013, right in one of your big auditoriums. It was such a blast. I had such a good time. We used the hashtag Sriattle, and we were trending #1, as you can see there in the city. It was just a great day to talk. We did a 2.5-hour, 3-hour session on digital media tips and social media. And that was back in 2013. And if you look at the date, it's March 18th. So right on the anniversary of that. And the idea of, all of us being, that hall was completely full, and we got to talk and ask questions and have time before and after. All of that made a big difference in how that went down. You can see some video clips of it here. You can see how busy it was, and in fact, they had to upload it in multiple videos. and they did that. So you all know where this is in the hub. And I wanted to show you a couple of moments that I'll never forget from this. An attendee named Margie decided that she didn't want to be distracted during the presentation. So she left her phone and her laptop in her car and then came to the event without any note-taking material. So she took notes on the paper plates that were given out with the snacks. And then she immediately, after 3 hours of the session, then went and sat in her car and then transcribed everything, which is kind of unbelievable, but shows you, how much people want to be together, how much they want to learn. And even today, or right here on the screen, she's put, you can see here, bit.ly as one of the things I always encourage people to learn about. And the names on there, Mark Lucky and at Erica America are both great journalists who really helped understand digital and social media. But this just juxtaposition of the physical and the digital here is amazing. So you can imagine how long it took her to transcribe things sitting in her car. And finally, what we were saying earlier that we wish we had kind of prep music, on hold music as people are coming into the Zoom call. So I always have some music during my sessions before we start. So while everyone is gathering in the hub, I was playing some Guns N' Roses, and a student came up to me and said, "Hey, what music are you playing?" And I said, "Oh, it's Guns N' Roses." And this was a very young student. So I said, "It's old people's music," I said. And I meant, old people like me. And somebody tweeted that out. Chris Daniels, who's a television journalist, tweeted that out and said, "Funny, Sri was listening to Duff McKagan and Guns N' Roses as he prepped for his speech. He called it old people music." And then immediately Duff McKagan from Guns N' Roses wrote, saying, "Who is this Sri?" And I was like, "Oh my God, I don't want to be caught in an alley, by Duff." So this was all part of the ways in which we got together, the way in which we learned, the way in which we shared information, the way in which we worked together. And all of that has kind of been taken out. When I was Chief Digital Officer of Columbia, we were thinking about the future of education. And we used to say that it would take till 2025 before more than half the professors at Columbia would agree to teach a course fully online. Well, instead of, that prediction of being those many years out, it turned out it was just 2020 in March, 2 days head start, and everybody was teaching online all over the world, and nobody was prepared. So back to the prompt and the question of how do we make sure that in the work that we do, we are making sure that we have the leadership that we need and putting together the various ways in which we do our work. So my company, Digimentors, creates events, virtual and hybrid events. We're just starting to work on graduation events. It feels like just the other day we were doing orientation. And this is one of the things that has driven us, our work. How do we make sure that we are recreating the best parts of the in-person experience and leaving aside the worst parts of the digital space? And that requires a lot of effort on behalf of the folks who come together. It requires effort on the part of the learners. The audience has as much work to do as do the speakers and the organizers of these events. I'm sure there's a robust chat going on. I'm not reading that now, and something is lost when I'm not reading and not participating in that, because the way you're able to do that. I think those chats are an integral part of it. When I teach, I use them, but you take your eyes away for just a couple of minutes and boom, it's all gone because it's all lost in that endless stream. So these are some of the things that we like to think about. And as we go forward, I would love to answer questions and make sure that we all continue to think about the virtual events. What have we learned that we can keep doing, and what are things that we can incorporate into world when we go into hybrid education, when we go into hybrid events or in-person events, where can we balance that out? And that's something that I have been thinking about for a long time and will be. And finally, just one more quick image for you. This is from one of the many events that we do. We did this 4-day event for UNDP, and one of the things we always say is we work very hard to work with our speakers to make sure they look good on camera. Now, as you all know, Justin Trudeau would look great on camera no matter what, but we did work with his team, and this is where, are there ways in which we can make sure that the technology that we have, it's accessible and easy to use and gives you equivalent or equal ways of communicating and sharing with everybody that you're trying to reach. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
That's great, Sri. Thanks very much for setting that up, and especially for that last example. I think, obviously we know that Zoom fatigue is real, so to think very conscientiously about how we design these events to make them useful and relevant to people as they join virtually, whether it's in education or in anything else, is really helpful. And we'll definitely get to that in the Q&A. So thanks for that. And thanks for the walk down memory lane. Becca, we'd like to come to you next. And I know you and I have had some really interesting conversations about how you've been thinking about design differently after the last 12 months and some of the really remarkable things you've been experimenting with, particularly in your new role at Instagram. So I'd like to pass it off to you to ask you that same question in terms of how have you thought about doing or designing differently based on this moment that we're in?
Yeah, thank you for the intro. And again, I'll say super excited to be here. I think doubly because this is a program that I've been a part of for the last few years, and I'm kind of coming towards the end of it. So yeah, super excited for that. And as Yuvanshan had mentioned earlier, I am a lead product designer on Instagram's well-being team, where I lead design for accurate information on the platform. So that in itself is kind of like its own, like, where did that come from? Like, it's a brand spanking new thing. And with that, we're essentially just trying to both fight the spread of misinformation and also provide a space for actual factual content. But then outside of work, I think there's, that balance. I founded a community for Black designers, first in Seattle, but now, since we're virtual, it's kind of like everywhere. And in that, we've really tried to foster growth, community, and opportunities. But what I did want to talk about today is that in my experience, and not speaking for any of the companies I've worked for, past or present, but I've seen it play out like this change in a few different ways. So, from the large tech company kind of mindset to that smaller organization. But first, really with the tech companies. They are incredibly visible entities, and they also have a really big track record for very poor equity and diversity practices, both kind of in the products they produce, and then also in the makeup of their internal teams. In design, out of the entire design population, there are only 3% actually identify as Black. And so when you think about these teams, you're like, oh, things like the H&M coolest monkey in the jungle stuff, that happens because chances are if they had, even 90 people on set, there wasn't a single Black person there to be like, hey, you know what, let's not do that. But especially in this last year, I think there have been a lot of fast-paced changes to try and create more trust and accountability. And it's gone well. There's parts that haven't gone so well. For Zillow, and for instance, it really meant making sure that some of their housing practices were more equitable. Since now they're actually not just a place for you to go shop for homes, but now they have the program that I worked on, Zillow Offers, where they're actually now buying homes from people in certain markets. And the real estate industry is something that has really maintained a lot of segregation, racial, just terrible practices. When you think about redlining, when you think about discrimination when it comes to appraisals. And so for that team, it was like, hey, how are we safeguarding against discrimination when it comes to home appraisals. How are we making sure that the offers we're sending to people are actually fair and is not changing based on the color of someone's skin or the name that they come into, if it's one or the other. And so that was something that really started up after all those civil rights protests last year. They also had to do things like really acknowledge and deal with the racism that their frontline employees may have to face when going into a customer's home. And that could be whether, to set up a 3D tour or to actually do work on a Zillow owned home. And those were conversations that they really were not having. So you had people, say I'm a Black employee showing up someone's home and not allowed entry. They're having to actually deal with and really take care of their own employees and really figure out how to navigate those spaces. And again, conversations that had not been happening beforehand. I left Amazon a while ago, but at Amazon, I heard of just so many committees springing up around, either ensuring equitable hiring or review boards about different designs and products going out. There are plenty of examples of very just racist products. You think about the Google image search and the situation where they took a Black man's face and labeled it gorilla. Or there was another one that actually just happened about a year ago, I think, where they had an image of a Black hand holding a thermometer that was a 0.1, and I never knew those had really existed beforehand, but now I know exactly what it is, because we've all seen it. And they played it through the image search, and then they basically took a paintbrush in Photoshop and then just made the hand white, and really badly. It was just a white overlay. And they submitted both photos into the image search, and the Black photo came out with the keywords Black, gun, hand, and the white one came out with white, hand, and then thermometer or something. And so even these super biased algorithms, those can come out. So Amazon, I definitely am sure it's happening at other tech companies as well, are building committees around stuff like this. And this is a panicked thing after last summer, which again should have been focusing on it before, but it's nice to see these conversations actually having being tracked as far as a success, no longer being kind of down below. It's oh, it'd be nice if this is not racist. It's no, this is part of our goals and our metrics. For Facebook and Instagram, even creating my role in my team, my team is well-being, and it's focused on just improving, making the Instagram platform better. And so my role, Accurate Information, is just acting to stop the spread of misinformation. And so there's work around last election. So, if there was the whole register to vote type stuff, that was the role that I was doing. And now with the COVID vaccine, there's things like the COVID Information Center on Instagram that we launched actually just a few days ago, to labels on all the posts talking about COVID. So we can say, hey, no matter what someone's saying, to get more information, you can go to this site. And I think all that's really good. All that's really important. All that is going towards, what you asked as far as how to create more accountability and do change, especially this last year. But I think there's always, like I said, another level to it. And so these companies all rush to make these racial justice and equity items a priority. But then also, you have to look at what's happening internally. Are all the leadership boards still white men? Internally, I heard this over and over and over again, just because of my place within my community, that these companies were relying on the extra labor and expertise of their Black or POC employees with no change to compensation. And so this meant more work for less money, people rehashing their trauma for the benefit of a business. And that can really, no change in their bandwidth in other ways, it's basically not being compensated to it. And then also it's not just like, okay, I'm spending more time on it, but then also I'm spending more mental energy. So my well-being is also going down. So, it's really great to, to be in a place where these topics are being resolved and good design being made, but it also should not be at the continued expense of marginalized groups. The second part of what I just wanted to say was from like the community standpoint. In my Black designer community for the last few years, and I guess in the whole like diversity, equity, and inclusion space, and especially after the protests last summer, there is an overwhelming majority of content in the DEI or diversity, equity, inclusion space that's centered around like diversity or equity porn. It is like the repeat rehashing of marginalized people's traumas for the white gaze. And so it's trying to tell people that diversity is important, trying to make a case for it. And even within the design field, or especially in the design field, a Black design professional is rarely found at talks, at conferences, in academia, unless they're talking about diversity or framing their professional experience within the Black experience. And so I really made a very distinct change in how I approach content and conversation within my community, where instead of having large events like I used to do that were more poised towards diversity in design, really towards like allies and having conversation around why diversity is important, we're working on content that actually meets the needs of our community to grow that skill set and create opportunities. Because like, not all Black designers need to or should be an expert on the state of Black design. And not all content that, elevates people of color and those voices should talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. And so one project that I'm actually gearing up for right now, that's not live yet, but you can always follow like an Instagram that hasn't posted yet. It's something called Designing While Black. And it is essentially going to be a collection of content that will highlight these Black designers, their skill sets. Like, hey, someone's like an amazing designer in voice design. You're like so skilled in this, you're so skilled in that, just like making people visible for the skills that they have and not the color of their skin. And so essentially a collection of like Black for Black content that everyone can benefit from, but specifically to create a space for people to really be experts in their own space. I think that is also a huge shift, because even for other groups similar to mine, because there's my group, there's like an African American graphic designer group, there's lots of other, which is fantastic, and there's a lot of other groups that kind of popped up. I've gone to those talks, gone to the conferences, and honestly, it's still been about proving out why diversity is important versus making the case for, making the case that you can be experts in your own right. And that's kind of how I've seen a lot of that shift in the last year.
Thank you, Becca. We really appreciate it. And exactly the conversation is about that, right? Kind of making sense of what's emerging and what's evolving. So thank you for capturing that so thoughtfully about this evolution of reactions and evolution of kind of creating structures of accountability, and then also finding platforms that really speak to the communities that are impacted, as opposed to making them more accountable for the type of work that others have to do. So thank you for your work and your thinking. And this is a great point to transition to Jenna and her really valuable work in thinking about accountability and trust in various forms of storytelling. Hanson shared that Jenna's journey started in more traditional forms of journalism, but actually there was a moment of shift, and I think that's something that you might share today about building trust and accountability in this moment, but by particular tools of storytelling. So I'm turning it over to you, Jenna.
Thank you so much for having me. I actually took some time over the last week to really think about the question that was posed, and I wrote down some of my thoughts in response to that question. So thank you for asking me to be here, but also thank you for this format, because it gave me some time to think about the context of that question. And there were so many white people in book clubs in 2020, and I couldn't really figure out why. What stories did they miss? What information did they need? Because they were there, they were sitting right next to me. And in fact, the story has always been about them and their violent system. And so I was confused about this seemingly urgent search for information that was already inside of them, the stories they had told themselves, the stories they had told their children. So when I saw the question posed for the conversation, and I really thought about it, how can we recreate accountability and trust via storytelling? I thought, is this one of those book club questions? Because I deeply trust the stories that have come through my bloodline and through my Blackness. These are stories that have helped me tap into joy. And these are stories that have kept my ancestors alive. And in many ways, I wouldn't be here if I couldn't trust the stories that were passed down to me. So it's the story of my grandparents leaving Mobile, Alabama for New York City during the Great Migration. It's the story of my 8th grade friend, Keisha, who told me that she no longer went to the Limited 2 in the suburb just north of us because employees followed her around when all she wanted was a pair of flared jeans. It's the story of my first broadcast news internship, where the only Black producer told me how to properly pitch stories about Black and brown folks so that those stories could get greenlit. It's the story of me giving birth to my first child at a birth center because I didn't want to be part of the 4 or 5 times more likely to die. And it's also the stories that my Asian American brothers and sisters have shared with me, specifically about the way in which Asian American women have been fetishized by white men and the places and people they seek to avoid as a result of the history and violence of colonialism. And so we are actually required to trust and hold on to these stories because they are stories about survival. In my time as a journalist within the commercial television news industry, I realized that stories that have been part of my body were reduced to what some would consider a perspective or a side of a story. And if you've been active in any book club recently, then you've probably heard of the term gatekeepers or gatekeeping, folks that control access to power, capital, resources, information. Gatekeepers must in many ways uphold white supremacist and capitalist norms, or else the system won't survive. So in the world of journalism, there are what I call storytelling gatekeepers. They are editors, producers, news directors, public relations specialists, communications directors. They control which narratives are told and they control how they are told. They are also control really what's newsworthy. And so in many ways, they must uphold the narratives that comfort dominant culture and drive demand from consumers. In for-profit and in some nonprofit journalism spaces, I have found those narratives often reinforce white saviorism, individualism, and a lack of analysis of systemic failures. The erasure of US colonial history, just to name a few. This storytelling is deeply invested in the exploitation of Black and brown grief and uninterested in the examination of white violence. So I could run through countless examples over my career of storytelling, trust, and accountability, but one of the most memorable stories that I've ever covered was the murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. And I was a journalist in Kansas City, Missouri, when I saw the initial images, and they haunted me really. Because the first was a body lying in the street in the middle of a neighborhood just outside of St. Louis, Missouri. The second was a burned down gas station. Now, the latter image was a little bit more unsettling because what it symbolized was a city being torn apart by rage, grief, and despair. Michael Brown's blood seeping into the asphalt on a street in his neighborhood was not an image that was unfamiliar to Blacks or whites for that matter. What was unprecedented in Ferguson was a community that had come apart at the seams, crying for help, a revolt against their treatment and marginalization at the hands of police and local government. So at the time in 2014, my news management, they were skeptical about the death of Michael Brown and the subsequent unrest. And they said that it was not a local story that was worthy of coverage. Once I saw the burning down gas station, I emailed my boss, the news director, no response. I called her. She said, no, this is just another officer involved shooting, Jenna. We're not going. So I decided to get to work early and meet my news director when she arrived at work to tell her that these are the same images that we've seen before. We saw it in 1992 in South Central LA, in 1968 in Chicago and Detroit. And if we're seeing it again, then we have reached another significant moment in our national history and our racial politics, a moment that needed to be captured by journalists. So she eventually said yes. I went to Ferguson for 2 weeks, gathering the stories that unraveled after the gas station burned down, but also really trying to understand why news leadership struggled to give us the green light. For her, this was a perspective, a truth that was up for debate because we didn't know the details. We didn't know why Michael Brown was shot. We didn't know what he was doing and if the officer was in the wrong. We didn't know if his hands were in fact up, and we didn't know if "don't shoot" were in fact his last words. But if you learned anything from this last year, is that those details are actually not the story. It was only after Michael Brown's death that journalists covered the real story. It was in every paper, on every radio, on every television set. It was the story that the majority of the city knew all along, which was that Ferguson, Missouri, a majority Black city, was governed by mostly whites. The mayor was white, the police chief was white, the police force was 94% white. Only one of its 6 city council members were Black at the time. This is why the gas station was on fire. White violence, white power, white control, which had historically left Black and brown people dead or holding on to and trusting the stories that would keep them alive. So there is trust in storytelling, and in fact, it's required. My favorite writer and friend, Brittany Carter, she wrote that the way that crisis in racial capitalism shows up is that people who are typically invisible or unworthy of care are made more visible and worthy of care the nearer they are to death. Journalists were there when the majority Black city was controlled by nearly all white people. So you have to wonder why this became newsworthy only in the wake of Michael Brown's bloody body on the asphalt. So maybe the answer really isn't reading any more books in book clubs. All of the information has been there all along, and the trust and the truth can be found in the stories that are required for our survival. So thank you.
Thank you, Jenna, and thanks to all of you. Hanson and I will start a few questions to transition into this portion. But those of you who are watching us, too, feel free to share your questions with our speakers as well, and we will share them with them. So, Hanson, I want to turn it over to you to kind of maybe get a couple questions and then I'll continue as well.
Yeah, I would love to begin with one of those last thoughts from Jenna, because it just really struck me as something that was resonant, obviously in time for Jenna is what she was talking about, but just especially for the last 12 months, that the nearer they are to death, the more worthy they are of care. And that you obviously speaking very specifically to the Black and brown experience of violence. But it seems like part of the reason why there's been this incredible outpouring of maybe empathy over the last 12 months has been that all of us have been nearer to death. And our privilege isn't necessarily protecting it from that. So we are able to see things differently and maybe to understand those stories differently and to trust differently as well. So I can put this to all three of you, but I'm wondering, how has this moment made us, sort of forced us into our own personal transformation because of maybe exactly what Jenna said in terms of being closer to death? And Jenna, please correct me if you felt like I misrepresented that thought as well.
No, I didn't think you misrepresented that. I mean, I think that's a reflection of kind of like racialized capitalism and the ways in which we only notice when something is urgent, when people are closer to death. And I think that is probably one of the reasons why this moment possibly brought us a little bit closer to that, because us being closer to death, I mean, we're now reaching about 500,000 people that are dead in this pandemic as a result of COVID-19. And we know that has disproportionately impacted Black and brown people. And so the death is everywhere. And it's not just COVID-19. We know that it's a function of the system. We don't have nationalized healthcare or access to abilities to take care of ourselves, really, as a nation and as a people. And so I think, those things became more visible within this moment with the backdrop of COVID-19.
Sri, I'm curious, just hearing Jenna and also just thinking about the work that you're doing specifically, both in terms of events and even with the radio series you've been hosting around making sense of COVID. How have you found, has the tenor editorially of what you do changed in these last 12 months in terms of moving away from that more? I really like that also, that there's also the narratives like comfort dominant culture. Have you put yourselves out there more in the events and in the content that you create as well?
First of all, thank you to both of our speakers. Incredible powerful reminders of how much work there is to do for all of us as journalists, and some of us who are in fact gatekeepers. I think that we have definitely been paying more attention. The problem is that, you know, if I was just struck by all the coverage of Drew Brees' retirement from the New Orleans Saints, the famed, very appropriately lauded quarterback. But he was when Colin Kaepernick was being criticized from the White House podium by Donald Trump about, you know, calling him terrible names and everything. He was one of the people who said took a stand against the kneeling. And of course, the NFL and everyone have kind of now completely embraced, at least superficially embraced that. And it's so frustrating to see that in that coverage of Drew Brees' retirement, there was almost no mention in maybe the second, third day stories. And it took Black reporters and columnists to write about this. And how do we then, because he did say the right things afterward, do we forgive him? How do we forgive him? What does that mean? I think it's very important for all of us to think about. I'd also just bring this to the issue of the anti-Asian American attacks that have been happening. And you saw the news out of Atlanta just last night. A friend of ours, Arun Venugopal from WNYC, posted this that says after every incident, people ask, are we sure this was anti-Asian bias? Does that, you know, we don't want to get it wrong. But he says, I think in a brilliant insight, that the real question is, what does this do to further terrorize the community? And what is our role in ending it? So it doesn't matter if that white guy who went and shot up those women, majority of whom were Asian American, if he got it, you know, if he got it, he was doing it for some other reason, wasn't anti-Asian hate, I doubt it. But even if it wasn't, it doesn't matter. Coming on this terrible year that Asian Americans have had, it just adds to the problems that we all see.
Yeah.
I wanted, go ahead. No, I thank you very much. And I actually want to build on that, Sri, and ask a question to Becca, because this was echoed in all of your conversations, in Jenna's and Becca's and Sri's. I think we're at a moment where we're feeling disproportionately impact of so many crises, and it's impacting particular communities, in particular Black and Brown and Asian American communities in a heightened level. In this moment, I think it really matters to have spaces of trust and accountability and building them. And Becca, your work very much speaks to that. Building a community is hard work. And around design and creativity, whilst I'm sure it serves multiple purposes. So in this moment, you talked about it spreading. Can you tell us, maybe share us how you built that community and how it works in this moment, what it captures and what it does for you and your members?
Totally. So even that has changed so much before and afterwards. Before, we were able to like meet up for drinks, and it was just like getting to know each other, have a community, you know, in that space. But then in June, amidst like the George Floyd protests started on my birthday. It was like, hello to this next year. So it really set that tone. And like going into that, I started hearing from the community. We'd have like a meetup every month or so, but they're like, no. I was like, they're like, we just need more. We just need like a space. We don't even necessarily need to talk about design. We just need a space with other Black and Brown folk to cope. And so the group started meeting every 2 weeks, and honestly, relationships just like grew so much. Like it was always there, but it almost went like 10 levels deeper after that. And so it was just like creating that space just to facilitate it. Sometimes we just needed to talk about something like real dumb and just have a space where we can like have that level of understanding and not have to like, you know, have that coworker you know, reach out to you being like, hey, like, you know, like, let me know how I can be a better ally. It's like, no, do your own research. And so it was sometimes a safe space to speak, but sometimes it was a safe space just to be, because I think there's both of that. Like it's, you know, Black and Brown people should not be the source of your information or the source of resolutions in a company. Like they should absolutely not be that. The other side of it, it's like you also need representation in that space for people to be aware of their blind spots. And I think after, like, really after the, you know, the civil rights protests are also when I kind of like had that reshifting even in myself, where having the excuse of, oh, I didn't really realize that there's so many structures of white supremacy here, was like, you know, it was a thing. It's like, okay, for me, I studied that in undergrad, like there's a lot of that, but after June, there was no excuse. There was absolutely zero excuse. And so people coming, like, there were so many posts about being an ally means doing your own research and not putting the burden on your coworker or your friend, or saying I have that one Black friend, because I am many people's one Black friend. And so it was really also for me, like it also very mirrored why my content is changing, because I was like, okay, I don't need to talk about diversity, because if you still need me to break down the levels of supremacy that exist within the US, the design industry, companies, then you are working to not pay attention to them. And so even with that, it's like, how are we just building ourselves up, and how are we building people who are marginalized in those marginalized communities up, and creating those opportunities and spaces? Because at this point, there is no excuse. Like, I love what Jenna said, as far as like, the closer you are to death, like the more important, but also I think the proximity to violence and the proximity to nonviolence has also been something that we have seen, because the amount of violence that happened during the the police brutality that happened when people were walking down the street, like where I'm in Seattle, the amount of things I saw, and the things that I, like, friends saw, and the everything, versus people walking up to the Capitol, breaking windows, going into like the top government offices, and seeing like how far from violence, how far from death they were, was also, I think, a really, really, like, a come to Jesus moment for everyone, where it's like, if you're not seeing this, you are really, really, really working overtime to essentially be okay with the oppression of Black and brown folks, and like being ignorant and blind to it as well.
And building on Becca's point, maybe to bring back Jenna in, is so talking about also this moment in accountability. You talked a little bit about kind of the structures that restrict voice, right? Or ask too much of particular voices as opposed to others. I want to kind of come to the end of our conversation in a slightly, not necessarily positive, but a productive note. I know that this moment had a kind of a productive outcome in terms of the types of kind of resistance to accountability and existing structures of trust for you. So could you share with us that process and what you've done?
Yeah, I mean, I left commercial television news because I didn't want to be part of that structure in that way, right? And so I did start my own podcast and platform called Lola's Inc. in order to be able to center Black women really as experts in storytelling. And so, yeah, with the exception of one interview, which is my dad, every single interview is with Black women as experts, as centers of those stories, because I believe that those are the experts that we should start to look to understanding our own world. You know, when I love the Daily, like the New York Times, the Daily. I do listen to that often and frequently. But when I think about who is brought on every day as an expert, they're mostly like white reporters. And so, you know, when you think about the impact that has on viewers and listeners, on what they think about as far as who knows the most about what. If we're constantly centering white journalists with white gazes as experts on whatever events that happen of the day, then you're going to get perspectives that aren't like centering Black and brown people. You're going to get headlines that don't explicitly use words like terrorists. And you're going to get things that don't specifically say that it is Asian hate. right? Because those are that's up for debate. That's and what they believe is a perspective or a fact that's up for debate, and not the truth, right? And so, you know, for me, it was really about saying, how do I not continue to like fight for my own space within this? Or like Becca said, like work to like constantly convince people, like, see my point? Like, don't you see it? Like, should do it. Can you do it this way? And saying, you know what? Nah, I'm going to create my own. And you can come listen to stories here. And you can come share those here. And that there isn't necessarily one way or one venue or platform to share and communicate storytelling and information. And that's what I guess it also made me think about. I think it's a great tie into this question, right? Is that like, there is that trust that exists, and it exists within us and within our spaces. And when I see like spaces that what Becca's building, is because there is trust in that space to be in community with each other. And we can continue to do that with storytelling.
That's great. So Akin, should we go to questions? Do we continue to engage our guests? What do you think?
Well, we'll engage you for a few more minutes if that's okay, and then we'll transition into our breakout groups. And again, for those of you who are joining us, you'll get to reflect on your learning and what you heard and hear each other in smaller groups. It's maybe Shri can reflect on this too. One of the kind of affordances of the moment is we can connect people in novel ways. And we've all learned about it in a much more rapid fashion than before. So maybe Hanson, one or two more questions, and then actually let me turn it over to our student lead, Tara, who's also moderating the questions. Tara, would you like to share with us a question from the chat?
Yeah, so we, hopefully everyone can hear me. So we have a question where the comment says, how does one combat gatekeeping when it comes to editors, publishers, etc., and dominant media who definitely do not want the status quo to change and are comfortable with power? Creating an entirely new space for ourselves is so tough and not always possible. Though Faya Lit Magazine have done a great job in the SFF world over the last year. So that's the question.
I mean, Shri and Jenna, you both, and Shri both come from journalism. Shri, you're in the capital of journalism, and you've been there for that traditional narrative that's being put out, and you've seen how things are broken down. You still work with reporters from the New York Times, and Jenna, you commented on that directly. Who would like to speak to that question?
Very quickly, if I could just say, I think it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game that that you have to build your own thing or work for the man, so to speak, and kowtow to what's happening there. And I think this is a moment where there is some, not everywhere, but in important places, an open, they are trying to find good, talented folks who they can bring on in various fields. And by the way, it's not just a race thing or an ethnicity thing. We saw even the way the New York Times handled audio, right? There was already a mention of the Daily. Like, one of the things that the editor, the top editor of the New York Times said is that we treated the audio production as not as important as print, so we didn't take it as seriously, and that's why we had those problems at the Daily with the Caliph and other things. So I think if you have talent, you have new ideas, you have a fresh voice, this is a moment where you can, in fact, get a hearing within big media organizations. Of course, you should continue to do, as we've heard already, building your own podcast, building your own voices, your own Twitter feeds, Instagram, all of that, TikTok, Clubhouse, all of that you can do. And those are fertile grounds for being recruited by bigger places. But you don't need to do that anymore. And that's the beauty of what the folks learn under Hanson and others about the way the media world has changed so much. And I think it's really a good opportunity for everybody. Things are rough, especially when the economy is bad. The importance of new voices is lost because they use it as an excuse. So I think keep fighting is important.
Jenna, you're a conscientious objector when it comes to big media. Have you been able to make a living in terms of your more untrodden path with the stories that you tell?
Yeah, I mean, that's like a subjective question. Yes. I have been able to pay my bills. But more importantly, I have been able to be healthy and well in my Black body without being within oppressive institutions that don't validate that. And that has been the primary focus for me, right, is to be healthy and well as a person. I do want to respond though to that question that you talked about, Tara, and I think in two ways. One, I do think that you can start your own thing, and you also don't have to look at it as like the thing that's going to pay the bills either, right? Like, I think that there are ways that I think the system, like, everything has to be like a side hustle or like extremely productive or lucrative or pay you six figures. And it doesn't have to be that way. There are ways that you can have your own voice in your own spaces, whether that is like a post or an article or a paragraph or like a meeting with a friend or a fully fleshed out podcast or television show. And so there are ways to construct that. I also think that there are ways to show up and resist within those spaces, right? To editors, to news directors. There were stories that, in my experience, in commercial television that, you know, they have a lot of rules around language that they refuse to use or language that they will use, right? That they think that is problematic for viewers. So for example, I did this story one time in Seattle where two young kids were called the N-word and threatened with a bat. And my editor at the time said that we as King 5 could not use the term the N-word, even as a first mention. And I thought that that was journalistically irresponsible. And so I think she wanted to reframe it as racially charged, right? Which is what you often see, right? Like it was a racially charged incident, right? And that, you know, the N-word historically has been associated with death for Black and brown people. And so it wasn't a word that was like interchangeable with other words, right? It was a very specific word. And I wasn't saying that we needed to say it 10 times on the air, but a first mention for accuracy would be important, right? And so she said that we couldn't do that. And so I refused to do the story. I refused to do the story if we weren't going to say the term the N-word as a first mention until we as an organization, as an institution, could have a conversation around the policies that we had decided on with probably no Black people in the room. And so I think that is an example of an individual way that you can resist that dynamic, right? Between the person who does have the power, right? Which was a white woman that was in charge of making a policy on whether or not we should say the N-word or say the term, the N-word in a story, right? And so you can resist that. It could cost you like it often does for Black and brown folks, but I guess that's just another way to possibly resist that power dynamic.
Thank you all. I think this has been shed so much light into so many things that we have to be thinking about in this moment, in coming few months, in the near future, and also the types of structural changes that we have to envision, and the types of structures that restrict us or restrict particular communities as opposed to others, that have an impact on trust, accountability in the various realms that we tried to cover today. So now what we're going to do is to apply the learning. Again, we've said, I've learned so much from Jenna, Becca, and Shri that I'm looking forward to being in a conversation with others. We've shared and we will share again a document that has some questions that we prepared for you. These are also questions that will inspire the questions we'll send you in our quick survey at the end for the badge. So we're creating a space for you to kind of get to connect in smaller groups and also reflect with each other and get to know one another So groups are random, but what you share in common is your interest in the subject matter and interest in this moment. So in just 1 minute, you are going to get an invitation to join one of our groups. And before you do so, though, I'm going to share it again in the chat. Please make sure that you actually turn on this document and have it ready, which has all the prompts. I shared it in the chat, and which has all the types of different questions that we ask you to answer. We will be here, some of us will join the conversations. Our speakers, you'll get an invitation to join. So feel free to join if you want to. If you want to, you can stay. If you want to, you can go back to your day. But we just want to thank you so much for creating such an opportunity for learning for us, for all the people who joined us today. And we look forward to engaging with you. But I'll turn it over to Hansen to say a few more words, and then we'll transition into the breakout groups. You're all welcome to join.
Yeah, and Sri, Becca, and Jen, I just want to thank you both for the effort that you put into your thoughtful responses to the prompt, as well as for your, frankly, courage and honesty in sharing where we are, where you are, and where we think we have to go. This is not a time for textbook answers for anything. This is why we saw this as a collaborative learning opportunity, and to be able to hear from you and to learn from you, and to frankly take inspiration from you makes a huge difference for all of us. So thank you very much for that.
Yes. So at this point, we're going to open up the breakout groups. Again, there are prompts in the Google Doc. I'll share it again here. And thank you all again for thinking with us today and learning with us. We will share in the coming days more information about the upcoming 2 events that are part of this series. And what a way to start it. So thank you all. So at this point, you're going to get an invitation to join one of the breakout groups. And again, the instructions are in this document. So you can see that you can see the instructions as to how to do that. So let's just bear 1 minute and you'll get an invitation to join one of these groups. Thank you all again for those of you who listened in the conversation, and it's time to apply it to your own context and to think about how you can use this learning in your own settings, in your own spaces, in your own world.